The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor as my new daughter-in-law's words echoed through the Mitchell family estate. "This is the family embarrassment we're stuck with," Samantha had announced to her wealthy parents with that practiced smile of hers, her manicured hand barely grazing my shoulder. The entire wedding reception seemed to pause, 200 guests turning to stare at the 55-year-old woman in the understated navy dress. That's when Robert Mitchell's face went white as his tuxedo shirt. If you're watching this, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Let me backtrack to how we got here, because, honey, this story is about to get interesting. My name is Margaret Thompson, but most people call me Maggie. I've spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of being strategically invisible, which turns out to be excellent training for what comes next. My son David had been dating Samantha for 8 months, and I'd met her exactly twice before today. 2 brief dinners where she'd asked pointed questions about my modest lifestyle and whether I might need assistance with expenses as you get older. The wedding itself was spectacular, I'll give them that. The Mitchell estate sprawled across 50 acres of perfectly manicured Connecticut countryside, complete with a chapel that could seat 300 and gardens that must have cost a fortune. Samantha floated down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than most people make in months, and David looked happier than I'd seen him since his father died. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress from a nice department store paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I'd learned long ago that the key to maintaining certain privacy was to look exactly like what people expected to see. A widow living comfortably but modestly on her late husband's engineering pension and life insurance. The ceremony was beautiful, even if I did notice Samantha's mother, Patricia, sizing me up like I was something that didn't quite belong. The reception was where things got interesting. The Mitchell family had spared no expense, with ice sculptures, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to open their own shop. I'd found a corner table, watching my 32-year-old son dance with his new wife when Samantha approached with her parents in tow. "Mom and Dad," she'd said with that sugar-sweet tone that made my teeth ache, "I want you to meet David's mother." Then came the words that changed everything. Robert Mitchell's champagne flute had frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes locked on my face with an expression of dawning recognition that made my stomach flip. "Margaret Thompson," he whispered, and suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. "Wait, aren't you the woman from the Mitchell Holdings acquisition meeting 3 years ago? Aren't you that mysterious investor who bought my company?" Robert Mitchell's words cut through the reception noise like a knife through silk. The color drained from Samantha's face as she looked between her father and me, confusion replacing her earlier smugness. Patricia Mitchell's diamond bracelet caught the chandelier light as her hand flew to her throat, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her socialite brain. The truth is, most people don't know what real wealth looks like. They expect diamonds and designer labels, flashy cars and obvious displays. What they don't expect is a woman in a simple but elegant dress who shops at normal stores and drives a reliable sedan. That's exactly what I've been counting on for the past 15 years. It started with my late husband Tom's invention, a small piece of technology that revolutionized smartphone battery efficiency. We were both engineers, Tom and I, working for a tech company in Silicon Valley back in the early 2000s. When Tom developed his power management system in 2010, we thought maybe we'd make enough to retire comfortably. We had no idea we were sitting on a gold mine. The patent sold for $22 million in 2012. $22 million. David was 24 then, fresh out of graduate school with his marketing degree and full of dreams about building his own career. Tom and I made a decision that day that would shape the next 13 years of our lives. We told David we'd gotten a substantial settlement, enough to be very comfortable, but nothing extravagant. He never questioned it, probably assumed it was a few million at most. What David didn't know was that $22 million was just the beginning. Tom and I took that money and started investing systematically. Conservative blue-chip stocks at first, then growth companies as we learned the market. Real estate in emerging areas, tech startups with solid fundamentals. Tom had a gift for spotting undervalued opportunities before the market caught on. By the time he died 5 years ago in 2020, our portfolio was worth over $800 million. $800 million. the same amount I'd later use to acquire Mitchell Holdings 2 years after Tom's death. The irony was delicious. While Samantha had been giving me concerned looks and asking if I needed help managing my finances as I got older, I'd been the anonymous investor who'd rescued her father's failing company. The same company he'd nearly destroyed through overexpansion and poor debt management, forcing him to accept a buyout from what he thought was a corporate investment firm. That investment firm was a shell company controlled by me. I'd bought Mitchell Holdings not out of malice, but because it was fundamentally sound beneath Robert's mismanagement. The company had good bones, solid customer relationships, and talented employees. Under proper financial oversight, it was thriving again. The man who'd just been called a family embarrassment had been living off my business decisions for the past 3 years. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, looking directly at Robert. "I think you have me confused with someone else." But we both knew he didn't. I could see the recognition in his eyes, the memory of that boardroom meeting where I'd sat quietly while my attorneys handled the negotiations. He'd barely acknowledged me then, assuming I was just someone's wife along for the formalities. Now, as Samantha stared at us both with growing alarm, I realized my carefully maintained discretion was about to become very complicated. The next morning, I sat in my comfortable apartment sipping coffee from my favorite mug, watching David pace across my living room like a caged animal. He'd called at 7 a.m., demanding answers to questions I wasn't ready to address. Sleep had been impossible after the reception, my mind replaying Robert Mitchell's recognition and the panic I'd seen flash across Samantha's eyes. "Mom, you have to help me understand what happened last night," David said, running his hands through his hair the same way he had as a frustrated child. "Robert Mitchell pulled me aside after you left and asked some very pointed questions about Dad's patents and your investment activities. I'd slipped out quietly after Robert's revelation, claiming exhaustion. The truth was, I needed time to think. 15 years of carefully maintained privacy had cracked in a single moment, and I wasn't sure how to handle the exposure. David had inherited his father's intensity, but channeled it differently. Where Tom had been methodical and strategic, David was direct and emotional. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I had a good idea. He wanted to know about Dad's technology patents, about whether you'd been involved in any major business transactions, about our family's actual financial situation. David stopped pacing and fixed me with those serious brown eyes he'd inherited from Tom. "Mom, he seemed to think you were some kind of major investor. It was bizarre." The coffee tasted bitter suddenly. This was the conversation I'd been both expecting and dreading. David had built his career as a senior marketing manager through genuine talent and hard work. He'd earned his position at a respected firm, bought his house through careful saving, and lived within his means because he believed those were the values Tom and I had taught him. How could I explain that, while he'd been working 60-hour weeks to earn his promotions, I could have bought his entire company without straining my budget? While he'd been saving diligently for his house down payment, I'd been managing a portfolio worth more than most small towns? "David, sit down," I said gently. "We need to talk." But before I could continue, my phone buzzed with a text message from Samantha. "Margaret, I think we should have lunch today. There are some things David and I would like to discuss with you." I showed David the message, watching his expression shift from confusion to concern. "What do you think she wants to discuss?" I had a pretty good idea. Samantha Mitchell wasn't the type to let mysteries remain unsolved, especially when they potentially involved money. She'd probably spent the entire night questioning her father about his suspicions, and now she was ready to investigate further. The question was, how much had Robert actually figured out from that brief boardroom encounter 3 years ago? "I think," I said carefully, "your wife is more observant than we've given her credit for." David's phone rang, Samantha's name appearing on the screen. He answered immediately, and I could hear her voice even from across the room, bright and artificially cheerful. "David, honey, I was hoping we could all have lunch together today. There are some family things I'd love to discuss with your mother now that we're officially relatives." When he hung up, David looked at me with the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he suspected I knew more about his broken curfew than I was letting on. "Mom, is there something you need to tell me about our family's finances?" Outside my apartment window, I watched the familiar rhythm of morning commuters heading to work, people with straightforward concerns about deadlines and meetings. I envied them their simplicity, their ordinary worries that seemed luxurious compared to mine. Everything, I said finally. I need to tell you everything. Samantha arrived at the restaurant 45 minutes early, already seated at a corner table when David and I walked in. She'd chosen the most expensive place in town, I noticed, and had taken the seat that gave her the best view of the entire room. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and she was wearing a designer suit I recognized from a magazine spread I'd seen recently. "Margaret, David, thank you so much for meeting me," she said, standing to embrace us both. Her smile was radiant, but I caught the calculating look in her green eyes as she assessed my simple black dress and modest jewelry. I ordered us a nice bottle of wine to celebrate being family. The wine was a Bordeaux that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Clearly, Samantha was making a statement about her expectations for this conversation. "This is lovely, dear," I said, settling into my chair, "though perhaps a bit extravagant for a casual family lunch." "Oh, I don't think anything about our family is casual anymore," she replied, her smile never wavering. "I spent some time last night talking with Daddy about his business experiences, and he shared some fascinating stories about corporate acquisitions and anonymous investors." David looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. "Samantha, what does this have to do with lunch?" She ignored him, focusing entirely on me. "You know, Margaret, I majored in business at Wharton. I find corporate finance absolutely fascinating, especially complex investment structures and shell companies. Daddy mentioned that when Mitchell Holdings was acquired, the buyer was remarkably discreet." I sipped my wine and waited. Let her make the first real move. "The interesting thing about discreet investors," she continued, "is that they often have very good reasons for maintaining their privacy, usually involving substantial wealth that they prefer to keep out of public attention." "That sounds reasonable," I said calmly. Samantha leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a delicious secret. "Daddy said the woman in the acquisition meeting was quiet, elegant, and seemed to defer to her attorneys, but he remembered thinking at the time that she had the bearing of someone accustomed to making significant decisions." David was staring at me now, pieces beginning to fall into place in his mind. "Mom?" Before I could respond, Samantha pulled out her phone and showed us a photograph. It was a news article from 3 years ago about the Mitchell Holdings acquisition, including a small photo from the signing ceremony. There, partially obscured by lawyers and corporate executives, was a woman in a navy blue dress whose face was barely visible. "The photo quality isn't great," Samantha said conversationally, "but the woman's posture, her height, even the way she holds her purse, it's remarkably similar to yours, Margaret." The silence stretched between us as David studied the photo, recognition dawning in his expression. I had to admire Samantha's thoroughness, even as I felt my carefully constructed privacy beginning to unravel. "That's quite a coincidence," I said finally. "Isn't it?" Samantha's smile had a sharp edge now. "Of course, coincidences happen all the time. Like how my family's financial difficulties began right around the time someone paid $800 million for Daddy's company. Or how that same mysterious investor seemed to vanish completely after the acquisition, almost like they preferred to remain anonymous." David set down his wine glass with shaking hands. "Mom, please tell me you're not who she thinks you are." I looked at my son, at the young man I'd raised to value honesty and integrity above all else, and realized that 15 years of well-intentioned deception had finally caught up with me. "David, there are some things about your father's patents and our investments that I never explained to you." Samantha's triumph was evident in every line of her perfectly composed face, but as I watched her savor what she clearly thought was her moment of victory, I found myself wondering if she had any idea what she'd just unleashed. 3 days later, I sat in my financial advisor's downtown office, watching James Harrison review the documents I'd requested. The lunch with David and Samantha had ended with my son storming out after I'd confirmed his worst suspicions, and his new wife making veiled suggestions about family financial planning and shared responsibilities. Now I needed to understand exactly what position I was in. "Margaret, I have to say, this is an unusual request," James said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the Mitchell family financial profile spread across his mahogany desk. "Why the sudden interest in your daughter-in-law's family background?" I'd called James the morning after our disastrous lunch, asking for a comprehensive analysis of the Mitchell family's current financial situation. What I'd learned was more complex than I'd expected, because I didn't realize when I bought Mitchell Holdings that I was acquiring my future daughter-in-law's inheritance. James's eyebrows shot up. Your daughter-in-law? The one who just married David? When I nodded, he let out a low whistle. That's complicated. Tell me something I don't know. He pulled up several files on his computer, cross-referencing data I'd requested. All right, let's walk through this chronologically. In 2021, Mitchell Holdings was struggling with debt service on expansion loans they'd taken in 2019. Robert Mitchell had overextended the company, buying smaller competitors, and when the economy tightened, they couldn't service the debt load. I remembered that acquisition well. It had been one of my more strategic investments, buying a fundamentally sound company at a discount because of temporary financial stress. What was the family's expectation at that time? According to the financial records we've obtained, Samantha Mitchell had been positioning herself as the eventual successor to her father. She'd worked there summers during college, completed her MBA with a focus on family business management, and had been telling people she'd be taking over the company after a transition period. The pieces were fitting together in an uncomfortable way. So when I acquired the company and brought in professional management, I eliminated her expected career path. More than that, you eliminated what she saw as her birthright. James pulled up another document. Here's where it gets interesting. I've been monitoring some discreet inquiries about your investment activities. Someone has been asking questions about shell companies, acquisition structures, and anonymous investors. My stomach tightened. What kind of questions? Professional-level questions. Not casual curiosity, but the kind of research that suggests someone with business training and possibly legal connections. He turned his monitor toward me. Margaret, I think your daughter-in-law has hired a private investigator. The implications hit me immediately. 15 years of careful legal structures and deliberate discretion could be unraveled by someone with sufficient motivation and resources. How vulnerable are we? That depends on how deep they're willing to dig and what they plan to do with the information. James's expression was serious. Your privacy protections are solid, but they're not impenetrable. A determined investigation with legal backing could eventually trace the ownership structures back to you. I thought about Samantha's behavior at lunch, the way she'd presented her discoveries like a chess player revealing a winning strategy. What would you recommend? Honestly, get ahead of this. If she's building a case for some kind of financial claim or family obligation, it's better to control the narrative than to be exposed by it. He leaned back in his chair, considering. But Margaret, there's something else you need to think about. If this becomes public, it won't just affect you. David's career could be impacted if it looks like his success was connected to family wealth he wasn't even aware of. I hadn't fully considered that angle. David's reputation in the marketing world was built on merit. If it came out that his mother was a major investor, people might question every promotion he'd earned, every client relationship he'd built. The irony was bitter. I'd hidden my wealth to protect him, and now that secret might damage everything he'd worked to achieve. There's one more thing, James continued, pulling up a final document. The Mitchell family's current financial situation is more precarious than it appears. They've been maintaining their lifestyle through credit and loans, probably expecting Robert to find another business opportunity or for Samantha to marry into wealth. And now she thinks she has. Exactly. But Margaret, if they're planning some kind of approach for financial assistance or inclusion in your investments, you need to be prepared for what that might look like. This isn't going to be a simple family conversation anymore. As I left James's office, I realized I was facing the same decision Tom and I had made 15 years ago, except now the stakes were much higher. This time, I wouldn't just be protecting my son's independence. I'd be fighting to prevent everything I'd built from being turned against my family. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened a bottle of the good wine Tom and I had been saving for special occasions, poured myself a generous glass, and spread 15 years of financial records across my dining table. If Samantha wanted to play investigator, she was about to discover she'd chosen the wrong person to underestimate. The numbers told a story of patience and strategy that I'd almost forgotten. Tom and I hadn't just gotten lucky with his patent sale. We'd been methodical, researching every investment, diversifying carefully, and reinvesting profits into emerging opportunities. That initial 22 million had grown to 50 million by 2015, then to 200 million by 2018. By the time Tom died, we were worth over 800 million, and I'd continued growing it steadily. More importantly, I'd been quietly building something larger than just wealth. I owned significant stakes in 12 different companies, held licensing agreements on 17 different technologies, and had investments in everything from renewable energy to biotechnology. I wasn't just wealthy. I was connected to innovation in ways that even James didn't fully understand. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom, Samantha and I would like to come over tomorrow evening. She has some ideas about how our family should handle this new information." I almost laughed. Samantha had ideas, did she? I could imagine what those ideas might include. Probably something involving trust funds and family meetings and a more collaborative approach to financial decision-making. What she didn't understand yet was that I'd been managing expectations and protecting my interests longer than she'd been working in business. I pulled up the legal documents James had provided about the Mitchell family's finances. Their situation was more fragile than I'd initially realized. The family estate was mortgaged at 80% of its current value. Their investment accounts had been systematically depleted to maintain their lifestyle, and they had significant credit obligations tied to Robert's assumption that he'd eventually monetize his business relationships. Robert Mitchell thought he'd retired comfortably on the proceeds from selling his company, but the reality was more complex. Much of his retirement income came from consulting fees and board positions I'd arranged through Mitchell Holdings' new management. His comfortable lifestyle was more dependent on my continued ownership than he realized. But that was just the surface. I opened my laptop and began researching the specifics of Samantha's recent activities. If she'd hired a private investigator, there would be traces, financial records, communication patterns, changes in her daily routine that suggested she was building a case for something. What I found was fascinating and concerning. Samantha had indeed hired a private investigation firm specializing in corporate asset tracing. She'd also been in contact with an attorney who specialized in family wealth disputes. Most telling, she'd opened several new credit accounts in the past month, probably financing her investigation with the expectation that it would pay off substantially. She hadn't married my son for love. She'd married him as an investment strategy. The wine was making me philosophical, or maybe just honest with myself for the first time in years. I'd spent 15 years being the discreet widow, content to let people assume I was living comfortably but modestly while I quietly built something substantial. But Samantha's little performance at the wedding reception had changed something fundamental. I was tired of being underestimated. More than tired. I was done. Tomorrow, when David brought his wife to discuss her ideas for our family's financial future, I was going to give them both an education in exactly who they'd decided to investigate. Because Margaret Thompson, the careful investor, was about to become Margaret Thompson, the strategic opponent. And I had 15 years of experience in winning games that other people didn't even know they were playing. David arrived at my apartment the next evening with Samantha, both carrying themselves like diplomats approaching a delicate negotiation. I'd prepared for their visit carefully, setting out a simple cheese and fruit plate and opening a moderately priced bottle of wine. Nothing that would suggest the resources I actually had available. "Mom, thank you for agreeing to sit down with us," David began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone walking through a minefield. "I know the last few days have been complicated." Samantha had dressed for the occasion in a conservative business suit, her MBA training evident in the portfolio she carried and the way she'd arranged herself in my chair. "Margaret, I want to start by saying that everything we discussed tonight stays within the family. We're all on the same side here." I almost smiled at her presumption. "Of course, dear. What did you want to discuss?" She opened her portfolio, revealing several documents she'd obviously prepared with care. "Well, I've been thinking about our conversation at lunch, and I realize we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. What I'd like to propose is a more collaborative approach to family financial planning." "Collaborative how?" David shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly uncertain about the direction this was heading. "Samantha has some ideas about how we might structure things to benefit everyone involved. The thing is, Margaret," Samantha continued, her voice taking on the confident tone of someone presenting a business proposal, Family wealth works best when it's managed strategically across generations. David and I have been discussing how we might create a structure that protects your privacy while providing more transparency for family planning. There it was, the real purpose of this meeting. I sipped my wine and waited for her to continue. We were thinking about establishing a family foundation, something that would allow us to make charitable contributions while also providing some tax advantages and investment coordination. She pulled out what looked like a preliminary legal document. I've had some initial conversations with an attorney who specializes in family wealth management. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd discovered I had money and immediately begun planning how to access it, complete with legal consultation and formal proposals. That sounds very thorough. The foundation would be controlled by a board of family trustees, she continued enthusiastically. You, me, David, eventually any children we might have. It would give us all input into major financial decisions while maintaining appropriate oversight. David was staring at the documents she'd produced, looking overwhelmed. Samantha, maybe we should slow down here. This is a lot to process. Actually, David, I think your wife has put considerable thought into this proposal, I said calmly. Tell me, Samantha, what kind of initial funding were you envisioning for this foundation? Her eyes lit up at what she interpreted as interest. Well, that would depend on the scope of the charitable activities we wanted to pursue. I was thinking maybe we'd start with something substantial enough to make a real impact. Perhaps 50 or 60 million to establish credibility in the philanthropic community. 50 or 60 million, as a starting point, from a woman who'd called me a family embarrassment less than a week ago. And the board structure you mentioned, I continued conversationally. How would voting rights be allocated? I think equal representation makes the most sense, she replied confidently. 3 trustees, 3 votes, very democratic. I set down my wine glass and looked directly at her. Samantha, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you love my son? The question clearly caught her off guard. She glanced at David, then back at me. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Do you love David for who he is, or do you love what you think being married to him might provide you? The silence in the room was electric. David was looking between us with growing alarm, and Samantha's composed facade was beginning to crack. I think that's an unfair characterization of our relationship, she said finally. Is it? I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, pulling out a folder I'd prepared. Because I have some information that might help clarify things. I returned to my seat and opened the folder, revealing the investigation report James had prepared on Samantha's recent activities. Her face went pale as she recognized some of the documents. This is a record of your communications with Ashford Private Investigations over the past 2 weeks, I said calmly. Apparently, you hired them to research corporate ownership structures and trace anonymous investors. Quite expensive from what I can see. David stared at his wife with growing disbelief. Samantha, you hired private investigators? It's not what it sounds like, she said quickly. I was just trying to understand our family's financial situation better. You were building a case, I corrected. These records show you also consulted with Harrison, Webb and Associates, a law firm specializing in family wealth disputes and trust challenges. I pulled out another document. This is interesting. You opened 3 new credit accounts in the past month, borrowing against your expected family financial improvements. That's quite an assumption to make. Samantha was scrambling now, her careful composure completely gone. Margaret, you have to understand. I was just trying to protect our family's interests. If there are substantial assets involved, we need to plan appropriately. Whose interests, exactly? I asked. Because according to this financial profile James prepared, your family's situation is considerably more precarious than you've been letting on. I spread several more documents across the coffee table. Your parents' estate is mortgaged at nearly 80% of value. Their investment accounts have been depleted to maintain their lifestyle since your father lost Mitchell Holdings. Most of their current income actually comes from consulting arrangements I've maintained through the company's new management. David was reading over the documents, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like heartbreak. Mom, how do you know all this? Because, David, when someone tries to investigate me, I investigate them back. And what I found is that your wife's family has been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for the past 3 years. Samantha found her voice, but it was shaky now. That doesn't change the fact that we're family now, that we should be working together instead of against each other. You're absolutely right, I said, standing up and walking to my window. We should be working together. The question is, what kind of work did you have in mind? I turned back to face them both. Because here's what I think happened. You discovered that I have money, and you immediately began planning how to access it. Not how to contribute to it, not how to help manage it, but how to restructure it so you'd have control over spending decisions. That's not fair, Samantha protested. Isn't it? I pulled out one more document from my folder. This is a recording of a phone conversation you had with your college roommate 3 weeks before you met David. In it, you specifically mention that you're tired of dating men who can't provide financial security, and that you're looking for someone from a stable family with good long-term prospects. The silence that followed was absolute. David was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before, and Samantha looked like she was calculating how quickly she could retreat from this conversation. David, I said gently, I think you need to ask yourself whether the woman you married is the person you thought she was. But even as I said it, I realized that this confrontation was just the beginning. Samantha Mitchell wasn't the type to give up easily, and I'd just shown her exactly how much was at stake. If she'd been strategic before, she was about to become dangerous. What happens now? David asked quietly. I looked at my son, at the man I'd raised to value honesty and hard work, and made a decision that would change all our lives. Now we find out what everyone is really made of. The next 2 weeks passed in careful silence. David moved back to his apartment temporarily, telling me he needed time to process everything and figure out what's real anymore. Samantha had stormed out of my apartment that night, but not before making it clear that she considered our conversation a declaration of war. She proved to be more dangerous than I'd anticipated. The first sign of trouble came when James Harrison called me on a Friday morning, his voice tight with concern. Margaret, we have a problem. Someone has been making inquiries with the SEC about your investment structures. Professional inquiries, suggesting they're building a case for some kind of regulatory violation. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of violations? Failure to properly disclose beneficial ownership in publicly traded companies, potential insider trading around some of your acquisitions, questions about whether your shell companies properly reported their activities. He paused. Margaret, this isn't casual curiosity anymore. Someone is trying to build a legal case against you. I knew exactly who that someone was. How serious is this? It depends on what they find and what they intend to do with it. Your structures are legal, but complex financial arrangements can sometimes look suspicious to regulators who don't understand the full context. If they file a formal complaint, you could be looking at months or years of investigation, even if you're ultimately cleared. The implications were staggering. Not just the legal costs and time, but the publicity that would destroy the privacy I'd maintained for 15 years. What would you recommend? Honestly, end this before it gets worse. Whatever family dispute triggered this investigation needs to be resolved quickly, because regulatory scrutiny has a way of expanding beyond the original complaint. I hung up and sat in my apartment, thinking through my options. Samantha had escalated from private investigation to potential legal warfare, probably hoping to force me into a settlement rather than risk public exposure. It was actually a clever strategy, if morally questionable. My phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. Mom, we need to talk. Something's happened. He arrived an hour later, looking haggard and older than his 32 years. Samantha's filed for separation, he said without preamble. Her lawyer says she's concerned about potential financial liabilities from undisclosed family assets. I almost admired her thoroughness. By filing for separation, she was protecting herself legally while positioning for a potential divorce settlement. I'm sorry, David. Are you? He looked at me with eyes that held more pain than anger. Because it feels like you orchestrated this whole thing, like you wanted my marriage to fall apart so you could prove some point about her motivations. The accusation hit harder than I'd expected. David, I never wanted your marriage to fail. I wanted you to understand who you'd married before it was too late to make an informed choice. By destroying her family's financial security, by investigating her like she was a criminal. He shook his head. Mom, I don't even know who you are anymore. That hurt, but I pushed through it. I'm the same person who raised you to value honesty and integrity. The same person who wanted you to succeed on your own merits rather than family money. And look how that turned out, he said bitterly. My wife is leaving me. Her family's financial situation is collapsing, and now I find out my mother is some kind of corporate mogul who's been lying to me for 15 years. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him the way I had when he was a child with a scraped knee or a broken toy. But the distance between us felt unbridgeable. David, there's something else you need to know. Samantha has filed complaints with federal regulators about my investment activities. She's trying to force me into a public legal battle. He stared at me. What does that mean? It means this isn't over. It's just beginning. And I need you to decide whether you're going to stand with me or let her destroy everything I've built to protect our family. The silence stretched between us. Finally, David looked up at me with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What do you need me to do? The meeting took place in James Harrison's conference room the following Monday. Present were myself, David, Samantha, her attorney Marcus Webb, and her parents Robert and Patricia Mitchell. The atmosphere was tense enough to cut with a knife. Let's be clear about why we're here, Marcus Webb began, adjusting his expensive suit as he spread documents across the mahogany table. My client has discovered that Mrs. Thompson has been concealing substantial assets while allowing her son's wife's family to experience financial hardship. This suggests either a deliberate pattern of deception or potential financial impropriety that warrants investigation. James Harrison, sitting beside me, responded calmly. Mr. Webb, Mrs. Thompson's financial activities are completely legal and properly reported. Your client's recent regulatory complaints appear to be motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. Samantha leaned forward, her voice carefully controlled. This isn't about personal grievances. This is about family responsibility and transparency. Margaret has been manipulating people's lives while pretending to be something she's not. I finally spoke. Samantha, I've never manipulated anyone. I invested in underperforming companies and improved them. I maintained my privacy because I preferred discretion to publicity. Neither of those things is illegal or immoral. You bought my father's company and let him think he'd failed as a businessman, she shot back. Your father did fail as a businessman, I replied evenly. I saved his company and protected his employees' jobs. Under his management, Mitchell Holdings would have been bankrupt within months. Robert Mitchell, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate what you did for the company, but you can't deny that you've been strategic about concealing your involvement in our family's affairs. Strategic? Yes. Deceptive? No. You never asked about my investment activities, and I had no obligation to volunteer the information. Marcus Webb pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Thompson, we have evidence that you've used your financial position to manipulate multiple situations involving my client's family. The consulting fees paid to Mr. Mitchell, the timing of various business decisions affecting their financial stability, even the investigation into my client's personal activities. Evidence of what, exactly? James asked. Of a pattern of control and manipulation designed to maintain power over this family's financial future. I looked around the table at these people who thought they understood the game they were playing. Mr. Webb, let me make something very clear. I don't control your client's family. I don't owe them money, I don't owe them explanations, and I certainly don't owe them access to my assets. But you do owe your son honesty, Samantha interjected. And you owe your daughter-in-law basic respect. Respect? I felt something cold settle in my chest. You introduced me as a family embarrassment at your wedding reception. You hired investigators to research my private affairs. You filed regulatory complaints to try to force me into a financial settlement. And now you want to lecture me about respect? The silence that followed was deafening. David, who'd been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. What do you want, Samantha? What would it take to end this? She exchanged glances with her attorney, then looked directly at me. I want a formal family financial agreement, something that establishes clear expectations and responsibilities for all parties. What kind of responsibilities? I asked. Marcus Webb pulled out another document. We're proposing a family trust structure with shared governance and defined distribution policies. Mrs. Thompson would contribute a substantial portion of her assets to the trust, which would be managed by a family board for the benefit of all members. I almost laughed at the audacity. You want me to put my money into a trust controlled by a committee that includes people who've been investigating me and filing complaints against me. We want a fair arrangement that protects everyone's interests, Samantha said. I stood up and walked to the conference room window, looking down at the city street where people were going about their normal lives, oblivious to the financial warfare being conducted 20 floors above them. I have a counterproposal, I said finally. I turned back to face the room. Samantha, you have 72 hours to withdraw all regulatory complaints and cease all investigation activities. In return, I'll provide a settlement that allows you and your parents to maintain your current lifestyle without further interference from me. What kind of settlement? Marcus Webb asked suspiciously. $5 million. One-time payment. In exchange, you sign agreements never to contact my son or me again. The room went completely silent. David stared at me in shock. Mom, you can't be serious. But I was completely serious. I just offered to pay $5 million to remove toxic people from our lives permanently. And judging by the expressions around the table, everyone was beginning to understand exactly how serious I was about protecting what mattered to me. $5 million, Samantha repeated slowly, as if testing how the words sounded. To never contact David again. That's correct. Marcus Webb was already calculating. I could see it in his eyes. $5 million was more than his client could hope to win in any legal proceeding, and it came without years of litigation risk. Mrs. Thompson, that's a generous offer, but it seems designed to break up a marriage rather than resolve a family dispute. Mr. Webb, the marriage was already broken. I'm simply offering to pay for a clean ending rather than a messy one. David stood up abruptly. Mom, stop. Both of you, just stop. He looked around the room with an expression of complete disgust. This is insane. We're sitting here negotiating the price of my marriage like it's a business transaction. Isn't that exactly what it's been? I asked gently. He turned to Samantha, his voice carrying a pain that made my heart ache. Samantha, I need you to answer something honestly. Did you marry me because you loved me, or because you thought I came from money? The silence stretched for nearly a full minute. David, that's not a fair question, she said finally. It's the only question that matters. I watched my son's face as he waited for an answer that never came. In that silence, 15 years of careful parenting choices, financial discretion, and protective secrecy crystallized into a single moment of clarity. $5 million, I repeated, looking directly at Samantha. Plus, I arrange for your parents to keep their house and your father to retain his consulting position at Mitchell Holdings. You sign the papers and walk away from my family. And if I refuse? I smiled, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, it was completely genuine. Then you get nothing. Your parents lose their house, your father loses his income, and you spend the next several years in legal proceedings that will cost you far more than you could ever hope to win. Marcus Webb was whispering urgently in Samantha's ear, probably explaining the mathematical reality of the situation. $5 million in hand versus years of expensive litigation with an uncertain outcome. I need time to consider this, Samantha said. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, the offer expires, and you deal with the consequences of the complaints you've filed. As the meeting broke up, David lingered behind while the others filed out. Mom, did you really just buy my freedom from my wife? No, sweetheart. I just gave you the information you needed to make your own choice. He was quiet for a long moment. What if she takes the money? Then you'll know exactly who she was, and you can move forward with your life. And if she doesn't? Then you'll still know who she was. And I'll make sure she regrets trying to manipulate our family. David looked at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with fear. When did you become so ruthless? I thought about the question seriously. I think I always was, David. I just never had a reason to show it before. The next morning at 11:47 a.m., Marcus Webb called James Harrison to accept the settlement offer. By 5 p.m., the papers were signed and the money transferred. Samantha took the $5 million and disappeared from our lives as completely as if she'd never existed. David filed for divorce the following week, citing irreconcilable differences. 6 months later, he called me on a Sunday evening. Mom, I met someone. Her name is Sarah, she's a teacher, and she has no idea you're wealthy. How do you know? Because when I told her my mother lived in a nice apartment and drove a reliable car, she said that sounded like the kind of woman who had her priorities straight. I smiled, feeling something relax in my chest that had been tense for years. She sounds perfect. When do I get to meet her? Next Sunday. But Mom, when we have dinner, can you just be the woman who raised me to work hard and treat people with respect? Can you leave the corporate mogul at home? I laughed, realizing that after 15 years of hiding who I was, I'd finally learned the difference between being invisible and being private. Of course, sweetheart, but if she turns out to be investigating our family finances, all bets are off. Deal, he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. For the first time in months, the future looked exactly as bright as I'd always planned it would be. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.